This has been an interesting few years. I have to say, last year, 2021, seemed like it was the year for rethinking work life, for changing jobs, being pushed out, walking away from work situations that just weren't working. 2020 had forced us to make changes we never thought that we could, working from home or getting sent home or furloughed or laid off or waiting to see which businesses would come back and which were gone for good. And finally, once vaccines and masks proved to be effective enough to save lives, it was time to make some choices. Work from home, go back to the same job, find another one, all with a goal of changing something in one's own life, with changing and improving the quality of life for oneself or one's family, and hopefully with effects rippling out into the world. I really think this is the kind of change that Jesus was offering in the story that we read today, that we'll be continuing to look at, this story that seems to be about fishing. Jesus steps off the dock into a boat, goes out a little bit with Simon. He's talking to crowds and getting a little distance. And then as he finishes up, he asks Simon to take him fishing. And he told him to go out into the deep water and to let down the nets for a catch. And Simon was exasperated because they'd been doing that all day and got nothing. But he said, seriously, if you really think so, we'll try it. And to their surprise, they catch so many fish they can't even get them in their nets, and they have to call in their partners and their friends to get the rest of them. And they filled all the boats, and they were shocked, and they were amazed, and they knew that they were in the presence of someone unusual. They knew their lives had changed in some way, but they didn't know how yet. We tend to take this fish story at face value and agree that, well, a net full of fish that's the miracle in this story. This fish story, though, is really about something more. It's about leading us out of our fear, out of our isolation, into deeper relationships of love. So Jesus tells Simon to leave the shallow water and go into the deep water, and venturing out into deeper things is risky. We like to stay where it's shallow and safe and comfortable and we can see what's coming. It doesn't take a lot of courage to stay where life is shallow. But Jesus was not talking about fish or water when he said to Simon, with his friends all listening, "Don't be afraid, for from now on, you're going to be catching people." Now, if you grew up in church, you heard this story about Jesus calling his disciples, and then like them, we also should, become a Christian and join the church and tell people about God. But I think there's a lot more to this story than what we've heard. Jesus is actually borrowing this image of catching people, fishing for people. He's borrowing it from the Hebrew prophets. Jeremiah used it as a symbol of God's frustration with Israel's complacency. Amos and Ezekiel used the idea of hooking a fish as a euphemism for God's judgment on the rich and the powerful of Israel. As he says, "I am now sending for many fishermen, and they will catch those people of Israel." So in the Hebrew scriptures, fishing for people was about hooking and catching those rich and powerful, unjust persons, removing them from their positions of power where they were causing all the harm. So by using this image, one they would have known from their reading of Scripture, he's inviting common folks to join the struggle, to overturn the existing order of power. In this story, Jesus calls a few people, his first followers, to take up justice work, the ones that are spoken by the Hebrew prophets. Now, Nicola Torbett reminds us that Jesus was identified as a carpenter. We all have that in our heads. It's written there. But we tend to assume that this is a carpenter like, an individual who's an artisan, and he makes tables or cabinets for home. That's probably the pictures we saw in our little kid Bibles. But the word that's used here for carpenter is actually translated more often as day laborers doing construction work. It is more likely that Jesus and his father, too, would have been low-ranking members of a peasant class. The same could be said of the fishermen, Simon, Andrew, and James, and John. Fishermen were, in fact, part of the lower class. They were subject to exploitation by the ruling class because of the taxes and the licenses and the tolls and the trade policies. They would have been surviving on the margins of an economy that gave more to the wealthy and the powerful. So we might say, as Jesus is calling his disciples, this is the beginning of his vocation as an organizer. This episode marks the beginning of the disciples' training, that training in the work of catching people, of organizing people who were falling through the cracks in an inhumane social order, changing that system for the good, for the common good. So Jesus was a carpenter. He was a builder who became a teacher. He was a rabbi, a spiritual leader, and a community organizer and a movement maker. And he chose people who were not the wealthy, not the financially stable, but maybe, as we would say today, living paycheck to paycheck, week by week. Margaret Ernst explains something else about this community that Jesus is building. She says the 4 fishermen named in this passage are described as partners with the word koinonoi, cooperative members. This word koinonoi is related to koinonia, which is the word that was used to describe the church. In becoming a part of this fellowship, you would become a cooperative member. Jesus was, in fact, intending to start a movement, one that we now call the church, but it was a movement that was focused on changing the social dynamics. Who's in control? Who is in need? Making sure that everyone's spiritual and physical needs could be met. He picked a tax collector, too, and a political zealot to start with, but he intended to change the way that this movement making, this culture changing was done. For this would not occur through violence. It would not be done with dishonesty that matched the dishonesty of others and the politicians. He didn't amass an army. He did not train them in tactical warfare. He trained them in nonviolent, compassionate connection. He believed that we could change the world with the power of God, and that would come about through learning how to live in loving relationships. Activist Grace Lee Boggs wrote, "Transform the world, transform yourself. Movements are born of critical connections rather than critical mass. It is not the number of people involved, it is the quality of the connections that you have." And Adrienne Marie Brown builds on that idea, talking about life as an activist, suggesting that how we are at the small scale is how we are at the large scale. If we can't relate to one another and work together at the small scale, we'll never create a large movement that makes change. She observes that, unfortunately, we don't know how to make decisions together or how to create compromises. This is because so many of our organizations working for social change are structured in ways that reflect the status quo, with a single charismatic leader and a top-down structure, and destructive ways of engaging in conflict and unsustainable work cultures. But this is where we need to begin. We need to see our lives and our work and our relationships as the first place that we can practice justice and liberation and alignment with each other. So Jesus started with a small, diverse group of people, teaching them how to get along with each other, how to live together, how to plan together in community, with compassion for each different point of view and each lived experience. So this isn't really a story about catching fish or about catching people with hooks or nets or any form of threat or coercion. It's about loving people into community. And our churches can be the beginning place, again, places of love that we offer that can be a gift of healing and hope, a promise of what could be. And that brings us to Paul's letter on love that we read this morning as well. We usually hear this verse read in weddings or maybe written on Valentine's cards. But Paul is trying to describe life in community, beginning with God's love for all people made known in Jesus Christ. Love is and always will be the best insurance against despair. And this is what Paul is trying to communicate to the churches that are growing in Corinth and to us. The relationships that we experience together in community, they can heal us or they can hurt us. But when we encounter unconditional, affirming, forgiving, accepting love that starts with God, our true parent, and takes place in community, in small community, it changes our hearts and our minds. It changes the way that we live. We need each other, and that's what it means to be the body of Christ. Because love is more than a feeling, it is something that is expressed in our actions, in our interactions with one another. Paul defines this love in a series of words that depict what love is and what love is not, and we've all heard them before. Love is patient and love is kind. And that is true for we feel an emotional resonance each time someone is patient with us. And when someone shows us kindness, we are changed. Paul continues, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. This is what we need in community. If we can relate to each other each day, each week, throughout the year, with people who rejoice with us, with people who respect our needs and our values and our opinions, we are changed. And this is how Jesus started the movement, gathering a group of people around him who saw themselves as powerless. Some underpaid fishermen, a hated tax collector, a few dedicated Hebrew students, and a political fanatic, and then showing them how to live together, to work together, to be patient, to let go of resentment, to share ideas and to make plans with kindness, to support each other through it all, and then begin to teach others to do the same. So these fishermen in this story were not just changing their occupation. They were changing their lives. They were changing the way that they interacted with people, whatever they were doing. And they were joining a movement that would change the world, starting with themselves. So this year, you may not be able to change jobs at this stage of your life. You may have already made some changes in your working situation, whether you get to work from home more or looked for a job that was more fulfilling. But wherever we are and whatever we are doing, we can improve the quality of our lives by improving the quality of our relationships. We can pay attention to and begin to transform our communities, following Jesus, changing the world one relationship at a time. And what begins small spreads out to the larger world as well. Now, next week, we're going to continue the story and find out what happens when Jesus tries to bring this message back to his hometown. Spoiler alert, it does not go well. But it is still the only way to live God's love in the world.